Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Irish Studies lecture. I am very pleased to introduce our today's guest, Patrick Freyne from Dublin to you. Patrick has indeed tried many things in life. He spent most of his 20s trying to be a rock star before turning to the much more stable and secure world of journalism. He has had short stories and essays published in the Dublin Review, Banshee and Winter Papers, and is a features writer at the Irish Times. Now, his book of essays, Okay, Let's Do Your Stupid Idea, was published by Penguin Sandy Cove in 2020. It was nominated for an Irish Book Award, longlisted for the Rathbones Prize, and shortlisted for the Dalkey Prize. From this book, Patrick is going to read several shorter passages today, and questions can be asked after each of the passages. Before I hand over to Patrick, I have to say to all listeners, to everybody who is here now in the Zoom room, that we are going to take screenshots. So if you don't want to be seen, just hide away, just switch off your video, and then you won't be seen. I just have to tell you. Okay, now, Patrick, we are more than happy to have you here as our guest for the author reading today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a million. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to start by reading, I'm going to read the preface of my book, and then I'm going to read a bit of an essay. The reason I'm going to read the preface is because memoir essays are a strange sort of phenomenon. Essays have become a really big thing generally, but I think in Ireland they became a very important thing in the last few years. But some people are still skeptical of the form. So I decided to write a preface about my friend's skepticism. So I'll just start with this. My friend Corncrake rings me. After some preamble about the events of the day, he said, "I read the story you sent me." "Oh," I say. "It's very well written," he says. "Thank you. But," here it comes, "I'm not sure who's going to read this." "Why?" "Well, it's just about your life," he says. "It kind of feels like stuff you should be telling a counselor, really." "Oh?" "I mean, it's stuff that happens to everyone," he says. "Okay. If I was going to read a book about somebody's life, it would be someone like Julius Caesar or Napoleon or some famous general." Julius Caesar, Napoleon, or some famous general. "It's very well written," he says again. He likes to be encouraging. "You know, there's a whole genre of work that's basically memoir writing," I say. "People who aren't particularly famous writing about their lives." "Really?" "Even 20-somethings write memoirs now," I say. "It's a very popular genre." "Really? Are you sure?" "I'm sure." 20-somethings? That sounds kind of stupid. Are you sure? It does sound kind of stupid now that I've said it out loud. "I'm sure." There's a long pause. "Well, you'd know better than me," he says. And then, "It is very well written." "But you'd prefer if it was about Julius Caesar." There's a pause. "Or Napoleon, or some famous general." "Thanks for your feedback," I say coldly. "No problem," he says cheerfully. So that's my preface. I'm going to read the start of... So that's my friend Corncrake, who appears throughout the book. That's not his real name. He didn't want me to put his real name in. So I'm going to read a bit of the first essay in the book. It's called "It's the Military Life for Me." It's about, my dad was in the Irish Army. So I grew up very much surrounded by army stuff. And when I was a kid, I was highly militarized. I was really into playing war and toy soldiers. And this is an essay kind of about that. So it's the military life for me. When I was 12 years old, my army man father brought me on what I took to be a bonding father-son camping trip in a stretch of the Wicklow Mountains. My mother drove us to the edge of civilization, where we got out of the car and walked up a dirt track. Along the way, my father cut and carved 2 walking sticks out of blackthorn branches, and after a few hours of walking, we camped in the shade of a wood by what I can only describe as a babbling brook, because it was a brook and it babbled. It was idyllic, really. We ate army rations of sausages and beans from little foil tins heated over a campfire, and from time to time I spoke coordinates that my father called out to me into a little walkie-talkie. Around 20 years later, the family was waxing nostalgic about this over dinner drinks. Why did we have a walkie-talkie? I asked. It was a strange part of the memory that didn't quite make sense. Well, said my father, we needed it to keep in touch with the rest of the men. The rest of the men? I don't understand. You see, there were rumors of an IRA training camp in the mountains, and the Rangers had been asked to investigate, said my father. The Rangers, by the way, were a crack commando squad, and my dad was at this time their commander. Right, I said. I figured the terrorists would have their eyes peeled for guards and soldiers, said my father. Sure, I said. But if they saw a man and a child, they'd think it was just a father and son on a camping trip. I thought we were a father and son on a camping trip. Oh no, said my father. That was just a cover. A cover? Well, you were really my son, admitted my father. I'm glad to hear it, I said. But we weren't purely on a father and son camping trip, he said. No, I said a little bitterly. Apparently we were tracking terrorists. My father nodded happily. Was it not a bit dangerous? Asked my wife. What if you'd actually run into trouble? We were fine, said my father. I was armed. You had a gun, I said. Again, my father nodded happily. In a shoulder holster. What type of gun? Asked my wife, whose hippie parents wouldn't let her play with guns, and will certainly, as a consequence, end up killing someone with a gun. I didn't wait for an answer. It could have been killed, I cried. But nothing happened, said my wife. And looking at my father, she said, right? Nothing happened, said my father. But he had a mysterious look on his face that led me to picture him drowning an IRA man in the brook as 12-year-old me slept soundly nearby. I wouldn't put it past him. That's all I read from that moment. You can ask me any question whatsoever about anything in the book at any point. Is there a hand up?
Yes, Teresa, I see your hand, or Teresa.
Yeah, hi.
Hi,
I wanted to ask you, with that story specifically, whether you now in hindsight that you know what that camping trip really was, whether you hold a grudge against your parents for allowing that?
No, I think it was just it was a different time, as they say. I think when I was writing the book, I had a number of different things in mind. Like, I wanted to investigate things in my past, things I was interested in. But I also wanted to kind of investigate kind of my feelings about the stories I tell, you know. So like, that's a story I would have told people and they'd usually laugh. I think I grew up with quite sensitive parents in a lot of ways that just happened to have kind of blind spots around things like that, which I think a lot, like, I'm in my 40s now and my parents are in their mid 70s. And we grew up around a lot of kind of mad army stuff that you kind of just take for granted when you're a child. Do you think I should hold a grudge?
I don't think you should know. I just wanted to ask, because my father also has some experience with the IRA, so I just wanted to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's funny, like in Ireland, there's a really interesting thing when people look in at Ireland from abroad, because you grow up with a very different version of the world when you're from the south than from the north. So in a weird way, like, one of the things I'm fascinated by when I reread my book is how detached I am from some of that stuff, because there's a weird thing. Southern Ireland kind of went on slightly ignoring everything that was happening in the north. Like, it was in the news all the time, but people in the south acted like it was almost something happening in another country. And I guess technically it kind of is another country, but the reality is that's just 2 hours up the road for me. There's a whole reckoning that's happening at the moment around the south and the north and the different experiences of the last 100 years. That doesn't get gone and doesn't go. I don't go into too much in my book because it's outside my experience. I think Marianne has a hand up. I didn't know that Zoom had little kind of hand symbols.
Yeah, the small emoji hand.
Yeah.
I had a question about the people you're reading to and their responses and the laughing. Does that depend on who you're telling the story to? And I wonder also if it makes a difference telling it as a story versus writing it as a story for people's responses.
So I've read a lot over the last couple of years, like since the book has been out, and it is fascinating. Like, it is fascinating what people laugh at and the things that you think are funny that other people don't think are funny, and the things that you didn't intend to be funny that people find hilarious. Like, I definitely think there's a weird thing where if you write anything, you have to kind of imagine an audience, but what happens when a book reaches an audience might not be exactly what you expected. Like, one of the things that was important to me when I was writing, I realized as I was writing, and I've really realized it since, is I generally like things that go to deep places but have humor in them. When I was growing up, I loved funny writers like Clive James, who was a British kind of essayist and journalist, Nora Ephron, who's brilliant, and and also even people like PJ O'Rourke, essayists over in America, kind of funny writers. There's another guy called Bill Drummond who was in a band called the KLF, and he had a book of essays called 45, which are quite funny. But in recent years, and I mentioned it at the start, in Ireland, there's been a wave of really good, really important, usually female essayists. So people like Emily Pine or Sinead Gleeson, my colleague in the Irish Times, Rosita Boland, someone else. And actually reading their work kind of spurred me on to write more seriously as well. So, because I realized, like, most of the films I like, most of the books I like, most of the music I like Nick Cave was one of my favorite singers, right? And Nick Cave will have very, very emotional stuff in songs, and the next verse could be really funny and dark. Like, people think he's really dark, but I find Nick Cave really funny. So I've always been interested in stuff that kind of manages to bridge the two. So I think if I'd written this book 10 years earlier, it would probably have been purely a David Sedaris style book of funny essays. But those Irish writers like Sinead Gleeson and Emily Pine, who I know and I'm friendly with, Dublin's very small, they really influenced me to kind of go a bit deeper. So there are a lot of things in this book where I tried to write about things that I had kind of strong thoughts and feelings about. Like, I have an essay about not having kids, partly, not quite by choice, I have an essay about a time I spent as a care worker. I have an essay about mental health difficulties. And like, humor comes into that because I think humor is an important way of processing things. I think most people in times of stress, funny thoughts come into their head, but what's interesting to me now and what's most important to me now is when to put the brakes on the humor and just express things plainly, so I think there are tonal shifts in the book that I'm quite happy with, and I like, where you go from something that you just experience as, like, I had a rule that everything in this had to be either entertaining or useful for the reader. And so some stories I'm just trying to make people laugh, but in a lot of the book, I'm also trying to talk through things, and I hopefully talk through it in a way that people find helpful and useful, because it's something, actually, I'm going on a bit of a tangent now, but it's something I talk about a lot with, I'm good friends with Emily Pine, who wrote a brilliant book called Notes to Self, and we talked a lot after she wrote that. I was talking to her about, you know, I think the reason her book made such an impact is because she was talking about very difficult things in that book. I recommend everyone to read that, actually. I think it's got 6 long essays, and some of it deals with her father's alcoholism, some of it deals with assault. There's a really good essay on not wanting kids and not having them. But the reason I think people responded to that is because when she wrote it, she'd kind of come through those experiences, and she was writing about them with a sense of perspective. She was writing them from a safe place. So when I wrote things in this book that were about more sensitive subjects, I wanted to make sure I was in a safe place too. So some of the earlier drafts said I have an essay called Brain Fever. I might actually read a bit of that in a minute, which is about mental health stuff I've had over the years, you know, difficulties with depression and things. And when I wrote the first version of that, I wrote like 6 or 7 years ago, I think it was neither helpful nor entertaining for anyone, because I was a bit raw. I was in a bad place when I wrote it. When I went back and just wrote it again from scratch, I was in a better place. And I think therefore it's both more clear-sighted about what I was going through. And it's also more helpful for the reader because, well, I think it is possible for people to write really good things when they're in a bad place. I just think it's kind of, I just don't want to do that. I think that sometimes that can be triggering for people and difficult for people. And I would prefer to write things from a position where people feel like, actually, he's okay now and you can come through these things. And that's something I really got from Emily's book in particular, which influenced me. I think that went on a tangent, but I'm happy to go on tangents. I think Samira has a question.
Samira.
Yes, and since you mentioned seriousness, because for me, the order in which you put your essays kind of gets more serious. So I was wondering if you had like a specific order in mind, or if it's just random.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not random at all. Like I didn't know I was writing a book of essays originally. I had written a few essays, one for the Dublin Review, and I had taken some time off my day job as a journalist, and I was writing short stories and I was writing essays, and I was sending them to my editor at the Dublin Review. His name is Brendan Barrington. He's also an editor with Penguin. And at a certain point, he just said, send me what you've written. And I wrote, the first essay I wrote was Brain Fever, the one about mental health. And he published that in the Dublin Review. And I sent him, the second one I wrote is Gigantic, which is an essay about a summer I spent in Bremen, which is just, like, it's just an essay. Like, it's, you could argue that there's some stuff going on that's deeper, but it's largely a romp about being an idiotic 20-something. And I was curious to see if Brendan also liked that, and he did. So I went, okay, I'm going to just write about, I will write about the things I'm interested in, and they will take the direction they take. So some of them will be a bit more experimental, some of them will be a bit more serious by design, and some will be a bit more funny or a bit more silly. And at a certain point, he said, there's a book in this. And that's when I started thinking about the order. And I'd probably written 2/3 of the essays at that point. And I used to be in a band, which I write about in the book as well. And one of the things I really liked when I was in a band was when we had songs written, was putting them in order for a set list or for an album. You know, like when, you know, you'd be listening to your stuff, your own stuff, and you go, oh, we need another heavy song, or this, we have to follow this slow song with a fast song. You know, you'd be making decisions like this. And I kind of treated the essays like that. So I'd start going, okay, I've written an essay that's kind of based about my dad, maybe I should write one that's based about my mom. So I wrote an essay called Cool Mountain, which is about a place in West Cork she's from, and it's about her family background. Because I'd written the military one that's kind of about my dad, really. And then I started going, oh, I need to write, there'd often be a gap. I think it was like, I need another funny one here between these two serious ones. Or I'd go, you'd kind of change the tone of essays a little bit. You'd go, well, this one, I should remove some of the jokes and make it a bit more serious because it's warranted. But if I do that, maybe the next one should be really funny. In what I think is funny, like you're the judge whether it's actually funny. So I loved doing that, and I'm glad, like I think a lot of people did say that they felt like the book flowed quite well. And I'm really pleased when I hear that, because I put a lot of thought into it. Like I think kind of when I look at I was going to say track listing, but when I look at the contents list, like I can see that the military life for me is largely funny. You know, the next one, The Thing About Me Is I Hate Drama, that's largely funny too. Like there's, all of them have kind of little serious undertones, but then the next one is Cool Mountain, which is about my mom's background, and that delves into kind of a bit of family trauma and stuff. So you can see I was going, so kind of front load the funny stuff, now we'll go a bit deeper. And this is just how I think. Like a different writer might completely organize this kind of differently, but I do think, like, you do think about the reader. Now it's an imagined reader, and actual readers are different and they might respond to it differently, but I was thinking about a reader that was a bit like me, who'd get maybe suspicious and scared if something serious was up front and would run away. But as it went on, I started dotting them in. Does that answer the question? Cool. I could read something else if that makes sense, and then you could. So I was going to read a bit from Brain Fever, which is it's not the first essay I wrote, but it was the one that kind of started the book, because it's the first one I sent to Brendan, and he edited it really well. This was an essay, like, one of the things I like about the essay as a format is you can get away, you can explore things in the essay. So in my day job, I'm a journalist with the Irish Times, and I do two very specific things. I either report on stuff and write kind of long form reports and interviews, or I write column where, you know, usually I'm writing kind of funny things about television or pop culture. And I hadn't written much about myself. And one of the things with newspaper writing is, say particularly opinion writing, is you start with a really fixed idea. Like a lot of opinion writers know what they want to say, and they kind of start out, you know, this is my point and I'm going to write that in 1,000 words. The brilliant thing about the essay is it's an exploratory form. So it's a great thing if you're not sure what to write. It's a great thing to start writing, because you can just pick a subject. And I've done it with a number of things in the book, things that you know you feel a lot about or think a lot about, but don't necessarily know exactly what you want to say about it, or you don't know exactly, you haven't nailed down an argument, and you can kind of explore it. So like I have essays in the book about singing, because I love to sing and I've sung for years in bands and in other contexts. I have essays in the book I have an essay about driving, because between my job as a journalist and when I was in bands, we drove a lot. So I knew I had a lot of experiences around driving, and I had a lot to say. I just didn't know quite what I wanted to say. And it was the same with the essay about mental health, Brain Fever. Like, I know that I had a lot of experience with counselors. I had a lot of experiences with poor mental health over the years. Like, I have good like a lot of people have good periods and bad periods in my life. And you can write about those things in a sort of modular way in the essay. So this essay is kind of an awful lot. It's a bunch of different kind of little mini essays in a way, like little anecdotes and stories as I kind of explore it. And it's a classic example of one that has funny bits and more serious bits, and it kind of veers tonally quite dramatically sometimes between the two. So I thought I'd read two bits where it does veer quite dramatically. So the essay is broken up into different sections with titles. Like, so I'm going to read a section called Narcissism, and then I'm going to read a section called, actually I'll read a few sections and see what you make of it. So this is the first one is about a relationship I had with my therapist where I didn't think she liked me. This is from a few years ago. So this is a section called Narcissism. It's an odd feeling when you realize your therapist doesn't like you. I spent the final month of a half year's worth of weekly sessions with Janet trying to convince her that I was actually tormented and not just pretending to be. Those feelings are quite normal, really, given your workload, she'd say. Oh, I dare say you'd feel a lot better after a night's sleep, she'd say. Maybe you're just hungry. Have you eaten? She'd say. Janet spent a lot of time trying to rationalize my feelings away, while I tried to convince her that they were real. Is it not meant to be the other way around, I'd think. But because I'm a stickler for authority, I'd also think, well, she's the therapist. I should have guessed the nature of our relationship early on. Slightly disappointed look on her face when she came out on a Tuesday evening and saw me in the waiting room. The way she once explained what would happen if we bumped into one another on the street. She'd pretend not to know me. I knew this was the practice. It's common for counsellors to do this as a way of maintaining the confidentiality of the therapy room. But Janet went to very great pains to outline the various locations in which she might pretend not to recognize me. In the street, in the supermarket, out at the theatre, while I was performing CPR on her after plucking her from the sea. I made up that one. Even at the time, I felt she was taking a bit too much pleasure in this. She seemed to be more worried about her boundaries than about mine. The point of therapy, I'd always thought, was it was the place where you could voice the shameful, buried feelings you had about your loved ones without being judged. With Janet, I'd begin outlining my dark secrets, and when I looked up at her, I'd see her looking slightly bored. I've heard decent critiques of psychotherapy about how counsellors can often reinforce someone's self-identified victimhood when they don't really have access to the full picture. Counsellors are too willing to take their client's side sometimes. Not Janet. On occasion, I wondered if she was a therapist at all. Perhaps I'd simply wandered into the wrong room one day and began unburdening myself to a podiatrist. If so, she decided to roll with it and take her 70 quid a session. The anxiety attacks and bouts of deadening depression that had initially led me to enter therapy were, at the time, getting worse. She had a simple solution. She told me they were getting better. I guess I should have stopped going to see her. Instead, I entered into a self-destructive battle of wills. For about a month before we finally stopped, each session would start with her explaining how I had made a lot of progress, and I would then spend the duration of the session explaining to her how I was actually feeling worse than ever. In retrospect, it seems clear that Janet thought I was a self-pitying dick and was trying to end the therapy. I think I sensed this even at the time, but one of my fatal flaws is that I always want to be liked. For example, I remember an art class in secondary school, during which a friend and I stapled the sides of our jumpers together in order to pretend to be conjoined twins. We were kicked out of the class. The next day, I went out of my way to try to make the art teacher like me again by being particularly interested in the Renaissance. He knew exactly what I was doing. "You are such an asshole," he hissed, which was the first time I ever heard a teacher swear. When I was even younger, I went to the Gaeltacht, where I thought the best route to popularity was to become a lickspittle for the older, cooler Dublin boys. I'd do errands for them and laugh at their jokes. I recall with burning shame the day one of these boys sent me to fetch his guitar in front of some pretty girls, just to show them that he could order me about. I got the guitar. What else was I going to do? I want to be liked. There's a talented young writer out there who once wrote something disparaging about my writing style on an internet forum, and subsequently, every time I meet him at events, I bend over backwards to impress on him how well-read, counterculturally, and generally clued in I am. It's pathetic, really. Janet's apparent dislike triggered something in me, and despite knowing that the sessions were doing nothing for me, I kept going in order to change her mind. It's no wonder she didn't like me. Reading this, I don't like me. Sometimes, looking back, I think that Janet's approach to therapy, suggesting to people that they're not mentally ill but just a bit rubbish, might actually be a good one. Maybe this is the deep realization that's dawning at the edge of most mental crises. Maybe we should just go with it. Ah, I see. I'm just kind of crap. Maybe that's what they call a breakthrough. I asked a therapist friend of mine what therapists do when faced with a client they simply don't like. Oh, we try and hide it, he said. I'm not sure we always succeed. The next bit is called depression, and I tried to describe kind of what it felt like when I used to get into a kind of spiral of anxiety and fear and dread, which, yeah, I'll just read it and see what you make of it. You know how on airplanes babies cry because of the air pressure and someone says, it's worse for babies because they don't know what's going on. Well, when they say that, I always think, but that's how I feel all the time. I want to burst into tears because I also don't have a clue what's going on. Does everyone else know what's going on? Is that what's wrong with me? Does everyone else know what's going on? And when I see a child having a full-on tantrum in a supermarket, I also think, yes, that's what I want to do. I want to do that. I want to lie down on the ground and kick and scream and trash. I look at the exasperated parent of the child and think, why are you being so judgmental? Don't you want to lie down there on the ground and kick and scream and thrash too? Don't we all want to do that? Isn't that the dream? Because every few days the world is out of alignment. Its sleeves don't match up and its seams aren't straight, and the lights are too bright and the tannoy is crackly and hurts my ears. The world isn't black, which is a shame because I wanted to be a goth when I was younger. No, the world is colorful, but the colors of this world are stupid and badly matched, and they make my ears ring and my throat gag. On those days, I don't see the point of anything. On those days, I would like to buck my body and bend my knees and erupt into a series of unchoreographed yells and jerks that finally end in a long shriek so inconsolable and irrational that passers-by think, someone should really do something about that. In my imagining, the passers-by stare at my wife, or if things have gone really badly, my mother, and think, why don't you do something about him? Because it's obvious that I'm too far gone to do anything about myself. And then they bring their gaze back onto me, and by now I'll be literally gnawing the supermarket floor in rage and sadness, and they shake their heads. And before I know it, big arms will pick me up, God's arms maybe, or a paramedic's arms more probably, and they'll take me somewhere where I can rest. That's a fantasy of mine when things are bad. Things get bad frequently enough. Usually when I take a break and I retreat into myself. Without the compulsive stress of work deadlines, I'm overwhelmed by choices. I become an anxious wreck, a boiling stew of self-loathing, an endless series of fruitless, pointless options. I don't want to be alone. I don't want to be with others. I don't want to think of the future. I am mortified by the past. Everything is too loud. Everything is too bright. My head hurts. I am exhausted. I am hateful. And underneath this swirling mass of thoughts, when my mind is clear enough to perceive it, there's a numbing and throbbing sadness. That's a bit of a downer, that bit. So I'll read more funny bits in a bit. If you've any questions about that or anything else, like one of the things I like about the essay is it's a place where you can sit down and try and explain yourself to yourself. And I think Emily's Pine has spoken about that a fair bit. I found it cathartic to write about more difficult things. Some essayists hate that idea. I know Sinead Gleason hates that idea. We've done panels together where I say things are cathartic. Does she find things cathartic? And she goes, no, I just write them down. But fire ahead with any questions you might have. Louise.
Lisa. Oh, you can call the people yourself. I don't have to get into that.
I just wanted to ask, do you always like writing about your feelings, or just thinking through things by writing about it, or did that start at some point?
So I never really wrote about myself before this book. So I've been writing for a long time in the newspaper, and I largely write about other people. Like I really like doing that. I've written a lot about things like homelessness or refugees, and I like going to meet people and talking to people about their lives. And I think probably as a consequence of that, and actually even in my column where I write about TV, I'm kind of writing about what I think, but not what I feel, and I'm not writing about myself, you know. And as a consequence of that, like I wrote this book, I was in my mid-40s. I had lots of material that I'd never written about. I have lots of things in my life I hadn't written about. And like I said there, I did find it cathartic to explain myself to myself. I don't think that always ends up in, like, it's interesting. Like I said, other people disagree and they don't like the idea that writing should be cathartic. But I found, like, say, writing that essay, I ended on a downer there with that one, but writing that essay I found really useful. And I think you can work through, you can kind of, like they say psychotherapy, the way psychotherapy is meant to work is that it gives you've got these narratives that are unhelpful in your head about your own life, and you go to a psychotherapist and they will help you kind of rewrite that narrative. So I think there is something intrinsically helpful about putting a shape on issues you've had in your life. What I would say though is that it doesn't automatically mean that that's good reading for someone else. So like, I kind of read the most depressing bit possible there. I'm very conscious of that. But the reality is that there was earlier versions of that essay where it was a hurting person writing about hurting. Whereas when I wrote about that, I wasn't in a bad place. I was just trying to describe what it felt like. And I also wrote things for this book that I didn't put in either. I felt it was useful to write about, but I don't really want to put that in the public domain. Or I looked at it and I went, that was useful to write about, but I don't think that would be fun for anyone else to read. So I highly recommend, I often say at events that like if you're thinking of writing, I think the essay is a good way to start, because you can just pick something you already know something about. Like when I'm writing for the paper, I have to go out and do a load of research. With this, your research is looking into your own heart and soul and brain, and picking through the stories and seeing, in some cases, you're seeing, do the stories make sense, and you're adding context. I often find myself ringing up people, like friends or family members, and going, is this what really happened? And they often had to correct me. And I did my best to include their corrections in the book. When it comes to things about your internal thoughts and feelings, like when I wrote about singing, I really enjoyed just trying to put down on paper why it was so important to me. And it helped me appreciate, like, actually, it's like some people hate analyzing things. Like I've interviewed a lot of comedians over the years, and some of them hate when people analyze why a joke is funny. Some of them love it, and I love it. I love analyzing music or analyzing a piece of literature actually makes me appreciate it more in general. And if you have that tendency, it can be a really cool thing to just sit down and go, why do I love this thing so much? And actually explain it to yourself. And then your second draft is turning that explanation to yourself into an explanation for someone who isn't you, you know, explaining the bits that need context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Marianne?
Sorry, I was just waiting a beat to see if that was going to continue. No, thank you for that reading. And what I found myself thinking about is something that you just spoke to a moment ago, the question of sharing, not sharing. in terms of experience, in terms of writing about certain experiences, because I found myself thinking as I was listening, we often talk about the current moment as being sort of an age of oversharing.
Yeah.
Put that way, that there's a lot of writing based on personal experience and sharing of personal experiences in different formats. But I wondered, as I was listening, it struck me as still somewhat unusual, particularly for a man, to offer that experience of mental health and anxiety. And I'm wondering if I'm overdoing that difference, but if it's not still, we overshare many things, but do we overshare mental health struggles? I am not so sure. And I am also not so sure if it doesn't have a different valence for a man, perhaps, to speak of those mental health struggles. That strikes me as being closer, I don't want to say into a taboo, but closer to the edge of the things that tend not to be shared.
Yeah.
Maybe your thoughts on what is shareable, what remains unshared, or this sort of question of there really being some sort of a tendency, sort of boundaries and distinctions there.
I think there's loads there I'd like to talk about, like the essays that I get. So I get contacted by, since it's come out, I get contacted by people who really enjoyed bits of the book in particular. And the ones that I'm kind of contacted about most are, so sometimes they're just funny ones, like that bit really made me laugh, or but often the ones that made the most impact are the ones that I think maybe are taboo. I mean, I'm not sure I'll talk about that in a second, but the ones that are most, that I get contacted most about, are the one about brain fever, the one about mental health. And in that case, it's usually men who contact me. And then the other two, and that I get contacted a lot about, and it's usually women. I have one about, I was a care worker for a while, for a year and a half, looking after people with intellectual disabilities. And I wrote an essay about that, and it's about care work. And I wrote another essay called Something Else, which is about the fact me and my wife don't have kids, and it's not entirely by choice. And it's an essay kind of exploring my feelings around that. And I get contacted. I was only contacted by one man about that essay, but I'm contacted by loads of women who said that they've read women writing about that, but they hadn't read men writing about that before. So I think there is some strange gendered things around these things. And like I said, I think I was very influenced by female essayists, like the Irish ones I've mentioned, but I also really like people like Joan Didion, Deborah Levy, like Nora Ephron I mentioned. There's another really good, I'm getting my names mixed up, so I can't remember a name for a moment. But so there is a kind of gendered thing, and I think that women do an awful lot of emotional labor. And I think that I was conscious that I was taking up some of the emotional labor by talking about these things. I think we do live in an era of oversharing, but I do think it's how you talk about it. And again, it's something, I did a panel recently in London with Butch and Aid and Emily, and I think we are all very clear that everything we ever put in our books, we've thought through, and we've also made a decision about both. We've decided to write about it, but then we've decided we were going to publish it or not. You know, there's things I wrote that I didn't publish. I know that there's things most essayists write that they don't publish, and that's about personal kind of safety and privacy, and the fact that not everything is for the world. Anything I wrote about was something I had processed, and I feel comfortable being out in the public. I think there was definitely a few years ago, I think it's calmed down now, an awful lot of online publications were paying very little money, usually to young female writers, to write about the worst things that ever had happened to them on like a kind of online forum, and then that thing would become it would go viral, and this poor writer would have to deal with the consequences of that. And I thought that was really unethical. like apart from anything else, I have a friend, actually Emily Pine's partner, Ronan Kelly, who's a writer as well. He says, apart from anything else, it's better to write these things when you're a better writer and you're older and you're more, why waste good material in your 20s when you're still feeling raw about it? I think there's a big difference between talking about all your problems on Twitter or Facebook and sitting down in a considered way and kind of writing about something and putting it out there. I think it's very different contextually. I think there is a service element. Like I didn't really think about it too much. I didn't think about that element too much before I published the book, but since it's been out, those 3 essays in particular, I get contacted about all the time because they strike a chord with someone, and it often makes someone feel seen, that their experience of caring or their experience of not having kids or their experience of mental health is being spoken about and is being reflected. Like you quickly realize that you think you're an individual, but actually lots of the things you write about are very universal, and that's where I think essay writing has a particular role. I don't think if I wrote short stories about those subjects, they'd quite impact in the same way. They might be more literary in other ways, but I don't know if they'd impact in the same way as somebody reading it knowing this is real, this has happened to somebody. I feel like I'm rambling. Does that?
No other questions? At least I don't see any other hands. Yes, we still have time, so maybe you
I can read another piece. I mentioned writing about singing there, so I might read a little bit about my essay on singing, just because it was very pleasurable to write, and it's just an example of the type of things I think the essay is good for, both kind of personally and also as a form. I'm just going to find it. I can't remember where anything is in my book. So this essay is called Sing a New Song to Drive Sorrows Away. And it was an attempt by me to kind of explain to myself and then to other people what I get from singing and why singing is important to me. Every winter, my wife and I go to a windswept coastal town in Northumberland to sing folk songs, guided by a famous English folk family. We've been doing this for 8 years. When we get there, we drink real ale and eat well and learn how to sing harmonies on top of old songs about shipwrecks and selkies and people being press-ganged to fight in foreign wars. We are, it's true, reveling in ancient misery while eating pies, but the music has a huge effect on me. When I'm singing in a larger group, I can hear frail voices getting stronger and strong voices getting gentler, and slowly I feel the edges of everyone disappearing until we've blended into one entity. It's terrifying and it's beautiful. I simultaneously feel very present and as though I might disappear. And when that happens, I feel tears in my eyes, and a crack in my voice reminds me of my own individuality for a moment. It's not just that my voice blends with the others, but it feels like myself does too, and I start to cry. I once read somewhere that music preceded language. Mothers sang to bond themselves to their children, and then some ambitious leader thought to sing to bond himself to his tribe. And it was only later that language began to attach itself to that melodic sense of belonging. I don't know if this is true, but it feels true. This is why we have national anthems. That's why tribal leaders and bards would sing, not speak, the story of their tribe. This is why people sang rebel songs and union songs and hymns, because when we are in harmony, we are blissfully enthralled to the group. These songs have a purpose. They're there to keep time. Fall out of rhythm in a sea shanty and you could lose a finger. They're there to unite the working man against his capitalist oppressor. They're there to remind us of love of country or the danger of the sea or the tragedies that come with loving an outsider. They're there to bond us together. I can feel that bond when I sing with other people. And if you were to randomly throw in some malign ideology on top of that sense of melodic belonging, I'd probably subscribe to it. If you were to subtly introduce a nefarious manifesto into the lyrics just as a minor harmony descended, I'd be yours. I'd be out with you in the front lines, flinging Molotov cocktails at the children of the enemy with all the other true believers. Such messaging is unlikely up in Northumberland. Most of the people I sing with there are members of the Bohemian bourgeoisie, teachers, social workers, left-leaning vicars, carpenters, retired academics. The most terrifying dogma I might subscribe to with this lot is an overwhelming desire to hear someone out. So every year I go there to sing and to lose myself. It's the only thing that works. When we learn a song, there's a period during which each run-through requires thought and concentration and nothing sounds right. But then, slowly, we approach a moment when the music becomes effortless and the lines intertwine into those huge human chords, and I find myself completely undone. I feel a powerful surge of emotion. I feel moved. I feel sad and happy at the same time, and I simply don't know what to do with myself but keep singing, even though I'm often singing while trying not to cry. I have no idea where this feeling was all the rest of my life. So that's the start of that essay. If you've any questions about that or anything. Eliza.
I was wondering, because you do talk a lot about being in a band throughout the book, and I was wondering how singing back then is different for you singing now, and how the shift occurred, and what triggered that, or was it just like this slow change that you didn't notice at the time?
So I kind of write about it a bit in that essay. When I started, I was, again, it's probably a core part of my creative identity, is that when we started, we were kind of a punk kind of band. It was about, it was very DIY. The idea was that anyone can do it. You just need a few chords. And we weren't particularly trying to sound beautiful or like, it was almost more political than musical initially. And then I became the singer. Like, I think a lot of men in bands, at least back then, became the singer, but actually it's probably an Irish thing, actually, because Irish people aren't hugely extroverted. You might find that hard to believe, but they're not usually extroverted. So in all the bands I've ever seen when I was younger, the person who sang it was by accident. No one else wanted to do it, or so I became the default singer in my band. And I think I have a decent voice now, but I didn't even know if I had a decent voice then. It was just about being heard, having a voice loud enough to be heard over a really bad PA system and a drummer who's too loud. And it's more, I always knew people who had musical families, where there was a lot of singing and music in the house, and there wasn't in my house. And the more I did the band, and the more, when I met my wife, Anna, her family are very musical, so they have sing-songs in the house, which is common enough in Ireland. It's not as common, I think, as some people who are not from Ireland think. I think there's a perception by some people outside Ireland that every sitting room in Ireland, there's a trad session happening. Now, there's a surprising amount to that, but it's not everyone. So when you meet a kind of, so I then, through Anna's family and through other families I knew, I kind of went, I just want to be surrounded by music more. Like it stopped being about trying to be a successful musician, which is it's a bit nuts and bolts. It's a bit about ambition or something, and it's less about the music. And it was actually more after I'd stopped being in bands, when we were kind of singing in the house. Like, me and Anna would play music here, or Anna's sister and her partner lived down the road, and we play music together, and we'd sing with friends. And we started going to that thing over in the UK. It's a band called the Unthanks. They're an amazing north of England folk band, and they do these singing workshops. And I just realized that I just love singing in a group. And it's not about it's not a means to an end. I'm not trying to make a record, or I'm not trying to sing in a concert. It's just doing it for fun. And which is why I wanted to write about it, because that was a kind of late in life development. I made music my whole life, but actually just really embracing it as something I enjoy doing it for its own sake. Which again, I think is one of the things the essay is great at doing, is delving into why you do things. You know, like a lot of my essays were written, like the starting point was me just writing down every single thing I can think of about singing, you know, all my memories with it, things that stood out. And then you slowly realize actually there's a through line, and I can figure out the through line. And then you slowly kind of realize what's happening, you know. You realize that you have loads of thoughts about stuff already. You just haven't necessarily expressed them clearly before. And I generally feel, which I think is in that essay about singing, and it's probably in some of the other things about being in a band as well, that I say this a lot, is that creativity in the Western world has kind of been stolen by a professional class, and everyone else is meant to be an audience. And I hate that idea. And I write and I sing and I do, and I'm lucky enough to be a professional writer with the newspaper and all the rest. But I kind of hate the idea that that's been taken away from people, like music in particular, but actually art as well. I met a guy, he interviewed a guy recently who'd been an addict for most of his life, and he discovered painting in his 50s, and now he went, after he got clean, and he went to art college, and now he's actually a professional artist in his 70s. Like, and you're just going, okay, so that was art and music and writing is kind of taken away from people, partly because there's a great line, actually. Elizabeth Gilbert has a really good book on writing called Big Magic, and she's a great line about one of the things that inhibits us as writers is, you know, we're too conscious of what the writing can do for us, you know. And she goes, it's not just write the thing. Don't worry about what it's going to do, where it's going to be published, if it's going to make you any money. She kind of goes, that's too much pressure to put on your writing. Like, if you take it back to basics, whether it's writing or singing or playing music, just try and create something cool for its own sake. And everyone should be able to do that, and everyone should be able to feel they can do that and not be judged as wasting time, or shouldn't you be out, I don't know, working or doing something else constructive, in inverted commas, constructive. Yeah, sorry, that's a long rambling answer, but the long way of saying that when I started writing about singing, I just started thinking again about doing things for their own sake. And when I was in the bands originally, it wasn't for its own sake entirely. Like, it was fun, but there was a bit of, oh, we're going to try and be a successful band in the scene, which is never going to happen.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I was also wondering, did it ever cross your mind to write a novel about your life? Because you said, I think it was your editor who suggested you write a novel. But did it ever occur to you to do something like that? Like
a novel or a book of essays?
The book. The book. Sorry.
It had occurred to me, but it, like I said earlier, I think it would have been a different book if I'd written it 10, 15 years ago. Like, I loved humorists and I still love humor writers, but I prefer being able to kind of go between the serious and the funny. And, you know, people like Nora Ephron always did that very well. And it was because of my interaction with Brandon, my editor, that this actually happened. I did have it in the back of my mind as I was writing the essays that there might be a book in it, but I didn't know if anyone would want it until he said. Now, there has been, like I said, there's been a bit of an essay boom in, I think it's a bit international, but I think in Ireland in particular, there's been a lot of books of essays in the last few years, and I don't think there mightn't have been a market for this 5 or 10 years ago. You know? I think Teresa has a question.
Yes, I have three questions to be precise,
Go
but
on.
they're pretty much interlinked. I would like to know, do you have a favorite essay in your book? And is there an essay you enjoyed writing the most? And which essay do you typically enjoy reading the most to people? Is there a difference?
There is a difference. So the one I enjoyed writing the most is Gigantic, which is the fourth or fifth essay, which is about a summer I spent in Bremen back in the early 90s when I was young and idiotic. And it was, the reason I enjoyed writing it is it came out almost in one go. And it's also one that people tend to like to hear read. So I might read a small bit of it. But and that was just because it was such fun remembering. I put on, it's named after the Pixies song Gigantic because we used to play that band all the time when we were over there. It was me, my friend Corn Crick, and my other friend Paul, who died when he was 35. But this is when we were in our 20s, and Paul was in my band. And the three of us went over to Germany and didn't have clue where we were going, what we were doing. And in the book, I talk about how, like, I feel embarrassed talking to German people about this, but I was so incurious. I'd learned nothing about Bremen, like absolutely nothing. We were interested in drinking, smoking dope, and hopefully meeting girls, but we didn't even really do that. And that was fun to write. I put on the Pixies and I just wrote to that. And so that was fun, and I like to think that because it was fun, it's fun to read. Whereas some of the other essays were more difficult. Like if there was a thorny subject, like the one I just read from on singing was fun to write as well, because I just had so many thoughts about it, and it's not really like, it's about something deep for me, but it's not about something painful. Whereas some of the ones about, like the one I wrote about, one of the essays that I'm very proud of is the one Care, which is when I was a care worker. But that took me a long time to get right. It was always a bit, because you're all, as a journalist, when I'm a journalist, I have a similar fear that you're misrepresenting other people. So you want to make sure you get it right. So that's what I'm proud of, but wasn't fun to write. It was like it was fun to write bits of it, but actually putting it together, there was a lot of self-doubt and self-questioning. And the same with the one about mental health. And ones to read, there's bits that are fun to read. Like there's bits that are fun to read just because they're funny to remember. I can read you a bit from, I've one about a parachute jump, which is also really good fun to write, called Gravity Blues. That's actually named after an old song we had as well. I didn't say it in the essay, but we had a song called Gravity Blues in my band. And that was fun to write because it's kind of circulated around the question of, it's really out of character for me to do something like a parachute jump. Like I still don't know why I did it. So some of the funny ones, the ones that are not about very serious things, were really good fun to write, because I knew that I was just trying to get back into a fun, something that's funny for me to remember. And then actually there's an interesting thing that happens, that when you start digging away at your memory, it dislodges other memories. So like when I'm doing those essays, like about specific things in the past, often like a question will come into my head, like, why was I there that day? Or who else was in the car with me? Like some of the stuff about bands, I'd ring my friend Dee, who was in the band, and go, that time we were stopped in the ferry, were you, who was in what car? These like really practical memory things that you think you'd know, but it's completely out of your memory. You know the shape of what happened, but when you talk to someone else, you realize that they have a completely different memory. And whenever that happened, I did rewrite things to bring in, like I'd send stuff to my mother as well to go, is that what happened? And she had loads of notes. She had loads of things like, no, that's not what happened. Did that answer your question, or did I go off on a ramble?
No, I'm totally happy. Thank you.
Thanks. I think Dominic has a question. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, actually, because you just talked about these your own memories of events being not quite that faithful, and
Yeah.
your mother correcting you. Did your friends and family who appeared in your book, did they feel misrepresented themselves as persons, or did they think you did them some good by writing about them, and that your perception of them is way better than they have of their own?
I don't know if my perception is better. And I don't know if they say that, but I showed it to everyone who appeared, who's still with us. Because I wrote about my friend Paul and my friend Barry, and they died young. But I showed it to people, and when they often had very practical changes, like things that they just thought I'd misremembered a bit. And usually I would just go, oh, fine, I'll change that a bit. There was funny ones, like my friend Corncrake, who's one of my oldest friends. So there's a thing you do in memoir that you'd never do in journalism. Like you use remembered dialogue, because you weren't walking around with like a dictaphone thinking you were going to write about it. So I'd often send people things and go, does that seem right to you? And when I sent stuff to Corncrake, he was happy with everything, except in my original drafts I had him cursing. I had him using the F word a few times. He went, I never curse. He never swears, or I'd never noticed this before, so I'd learned something. And he went, so I'm happy with all that, but could you just get rid of the F words, because I don't curse. And that's what was important to him. Like, even though there's bits of the book that make him look really silly, he didn't care about that. He thought those were funny, but it was important to him that he wasn't swearing. So I removed the swears. I think for the most part, the essay about my mother's family, it's called Cool Mountain. And I had to talk to her a lot about, just to make sure she was comfortable. And she did have a couple of small things. They didn't make a huge difference to the essay, but a couple of factual things a couple of things you wanted just not to be mentioned, or and I was happy to do that. Like, I feel like my friend D, who was in the band with me, and he's still a close friend, and he's also in the book a fair bit. His take on it is that this is my version, and he's completely happy for my version to be there. And if he wrote about it, it might be a bit different, but he doesn't think he doesn't think my version is wrong. He just thinks he'd write about it from a different perspective, and he was completely happy with everything. And I think that's the reality. The reality is, when you're writing about these things, you're coming from an angle on it, and somebody else's angle might be very different. Like one interesting criticism that I did think about was it wasn't someone I know very well, but I have an essay about pirate radio stations in Dublin in the 90s that we would have been part of. And one person said, because I made it a bit it was a bit about the folly of youth and youthful idealism, which was really good and useful to me and shaped who I am. But someone said, I'd really love you to write a really thorough essay about the underlying politics of these stations and, what they meant at the time. And that person's right. That would be a really good essay. It's just a different essay. Mine was about us as people, and what they want. And actually someone should write, and maybe I should write it, is what was the socio-political reality of pirate radio in Dublin. So there's always going to be that. There's always going to be a slight difference between how you might approach something about a real event and how someone else might. But I think if you're coming at something in good faith and you're not deliberately trying to hurt or embarrass someone, people are usually good with it. I showed everyone, I've spoken to other people who've written memoir stuff and they showed nobody. I showed friends and family things just to make sure they were okay. And often the things they wanted changed were not the things they expected or worried about. They were completely happy with the thing I was worried about. And then they'd go, I didn't have a red car. You go, okay. That's fine. You're fine with this other bit where I'm worried you come across quite badly. No, that's grand. Just get the thing about the car right. So that's interesting in itself. Oh, I think Louisa has a.
And we kind of had this topic before, but how do you choose the topics for your essays?
So initially randomly, initially I just went, what do I want to write about? Like I had a list. I keep notebooks, like I keep big black notebooks like this, and I like write lists in them all the time. I just write neurotic lists, and I would have a list of things I knew I kind of wanted to write about, and I would, if I had a day that I was going to write, I would pick one the night before, so I slept on it, and then I'd get up and I would just have a go at something. But when I knew it was going to be a book, I definitely picked subjects to fill in gaps. So I think I said already, the first essays I really wrote, I'd written the one about the band for the paper, the first one about the band ages ago. And then I wrote the brain fever essay. And then I wrote Gigantic about being in Bremen, which is a very different tone. And that kind of set in a way the kind of two polar extremes. There was kind of stuff where I was going to deal with more serious things, and then there was things where I was just trying to indulge myself in memory and try to make people laugh a bit. And then as it went on, I would write essays to fill some gaps. So I might, like I remember I wrote the one about the birth of my brother, just a short funny essay about him going missing in the hospital, which actually you could write a serious essay about because it's quite serious. But it worked out a way. They found him. But when I wrote that because I knew that it was kind of funny, and I felt like I needed another funny essay for the latter half of the book. And so I wrote things in that way. The one about the very last thing in the book is something. It's a very short essay about dreams I had about my friend Paul after he died. And that's actually something I wrote a long time ago, probably a few years after Paul died. And I found it when I was kind of finishing the book. I found it on my hard drive and rewrote it and said I thought it would be a good one to end the book on. So there was kind of little weird things like that where you kind of realized that there was a gap, so you'd fill the gap. Like I don't think it would be possible for me. I will write another book of essays, but I don't think it would be possible for me to write a book like this one, because this is about, like, it's in the title, okay, let's do your stupid idea. Like, it is kind of mapping me going from a young idiot to a slightly wiser old idiot, you know, and that's kind of what the book ultimately kind of maps. Through the things that I've done and the experiences I've had, but also through talking about the things that have shaped me and that I'm into, and the things I'm kind of interested in. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
I think Paula has her hand up.
Yes, I also have a question about the essay in which you talk about Cool Mountain and your family.
Yeah.
You say that it was a different time, are the saddest words in Ireland. Can you explain that further?
Yeah. So I think Ireland probably has had one of the most dramatic kind of social changes in the last 20 years in Western Europe anyway. We went from, when I was growing up, it was kind of the tail end of an unofficial theocracy in Ireland. There was the church had its fingers in everything and ran everything. And that started to change in the 80s. And it dramatically changed, I think, from the noughties on so that, you know, in the last 5 years, there was the equal marriage referendum, which allowed gay people to get married. And there was the repealing the 8th Amendment, which after years of heartache allowed abortion in Ireland. So there's an awful lot. One of the reasons I think there was an essay boom in Ireland is there was an awful lot unsaid in Ireland, there was a long history of clerical dominance and clerical abuse. There was institutions, like it's been well publicized. There was Magdalene laundries where unmarried mothers were sent, and they were basically prisons. There was horrible things going on through the 60s, 70s into the 80s, like right from the birth of the state. So there was a lot of silence and there was a lot of taboos in Ireland, and that changed really dramatically in my lifetime. Like I experienced the tail end of that, really. I'm 47, so it was still hanging on there in the 80s. The church was still quite in control, and then it kind of disappeared. And what's fascinating now is a lot of Irish people will call themselves Catholic, but we're not a church-going nation. We're not a religious nation. The church still has legacy connections to things. So when I wrote that essay, like that's about my mother's life, things weren't spoken about. So one of the things in that essay is after my grandmother died, my mother and her sister discovered, just looking through documents, that my grandmother had been pregnant when she got married. That would have been a massive scandal in Ireland in the 40s, you know, and like it would have still been a scandal in Ireland in the 80s because we were such a church-dominated country. So none of that stuff. So she found out all these things. Like my mother is fascinated in her past, and she's fascinated in history. She was a history teacher in secondary school for years. So Ireland was a place where there was an awful lot unsaid, and that is part of the cruelty of this country. I'm sure it's true in every country, but it was it probably ended later in Ireland than it did in a lot of European countries. So, and when we say Ireland, whenever someone said it was a different time, in this context, if someone in Ireland goes, it was a different time, what they mean is that was unspeakably cruel and we just put up with it, you know? And there was a lot of unspeakable cruelty. And speaking of unspeakable, like I think that's where, in the conversation I had recently with Sinead Gleeson and Emily Pine, we were kind of talking about the unspeakable, like an awful lot of the things, particularly in like Emily's essays, but an awful lot of the things that in theatre in Ireland and novels in Ireland at the moment is kind of saying the things that were unsayable. And in the past, I think people used to do it through novels. They could never quite write about the real world. So you'd had John McGahern or Ed O'Brien would write about things that were unsayable in novels, but it's in recent years that there's been kind of first person testimony in essays. And also actually the two referendums I mentioned, like they were built on people telling their own stories, you know. So the gay marriage referendum was people talking about their lives, gay people talking about their lives and how important this would be for them. The abortion referendum in particular, nobody spoke about abortion except in the years prior to that, women started telling their stories. There's a really good actor and writer and comedian actually called Tara Flynn, and she's done a lot of one-person shows kind of around that stuff. She was one of the people who spoke about having an abortion, and all those things are kind of linked. Like I think Emily's essay and the kind of emergence of a more open country, it's all kind of happened in the last 20 years, you know. Whereas I mean, you could tell me differently, but I imagine, like, I just have, when I was growing up in the 80s, Ireland felt like a kind of medieval backwater, and the rest of Europe, like Germany, the UK, France, everyone just seemed so liberal and open, and I mean, it's a comparative thing because Britain the UK doesn't seem more liberal and open than Ireland now, but when I was growing up it did, but most of Europe still does, you know. Hope that answers your question and didn't ramble.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there's also the book by Derek Kelly, The Best
Yeah,
Word,
great.
which deals with exactly those problems.
Yeah.
or topics.
I highly recommend that. He's a colleague in the Irish Times as well. I think some of his questions to write.
Yes, somebody, yeah, Chura has problems with the microphone. What was the most positive experience you had because of this book? And did writing everything down change something in your perspective on the things you experienced?
To the latter question, it definitely did. Like, particularly actually, that essay Brain Fever kind of helped me process some stuff, and the essay Something Else, which is about me, it was me coming to terms with us not having children, because I write about the kind of complex feelings I have about that, but writing that down definitely helped me. I felt like I processed it more. In terms of there's been a lot of positive things from the book. Like, the nicest thing is when people get in touch about a particular essay because they found it that helped them. And actually, it's even nicer in person. So it unfortunately came out during COVID, so everything was shut down. There was no launch. There was no literary festivals. But in the last year and a half, I've been going to kind of literary festivals and events, and one of the nicest things is actually people coming up in events to talk to me one-on-one about an essay that meant a lot to them. And that's really nice. And actually, Emily was talking about that at the event we were doing recently, that you sometimes think nobody's gonna, like, you're gonna write something and it's just very personal and individual, and why would anyone else want to read this? And one of the really kind of gratifying things is to realize how universal some of these things are, so that when you write it down, somebody else reads it and it helps them process things, which I hadn't quite expected.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just put the link into the chat.
Yeah.
Eric Skeller's book. It just went off too early. This is why a gap is missing.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you while you were talking.
No problem. I can read another bit. I'll read a bit that I always enjoy reading. Because there was a question about that. This is short. So it's from the essay on the parachute jump I did when I was 20. And I just enjoyed writing it. Like, sometimes you or I sat down to write things not really knowing whether I'd have enough memories or thoughts, and things just kind of flew. Like, they kind of, like, this essay and the one on Bremen were ones that were just fun to write, you know. And they're definitely it's quite an unserious essay, and I actually think there's a room for that too, you know. I like things that are just designed to make people laugh, as well as things that kind of prod your thoughts and conscience and feelings. So this is about jumping out of a plane, and I'm going to start. I'm at this point in the essay, I'm in the plane with the instructor and two other people who are going to jump out of the plane, and there's a guy called Carl, and he's about to jump out of the plane, and I'm next. Let me tell you how you jump from a small plane. First, you reach out of the plane above the tremendous void of air that falls for thousands of feet beneath you, and you grab with your right hand the beam that runs diagonally from the base of the plane up to the wing. Then you step onto the step below the door, your right hand still grasping the beam, and you grab another bit of the beam with your other hand. Then, despite millions of years of evolution, during which we did not grow wings, you step off the aforementioned step and hang by the arms, your legs flapping in the air, very, very high above your mortal enemy, the ground. Then Steve counts to 3, and if you're Carl, you do not let go, and if you continue to hang there with a panicked expression on your face. Let go, said Steve. I've changed my mind, said Carl. No, that's wrong. I'm getting the tone wrong. Let me try again. It was more like, I've changed my mind, screamed Carl, screamingly from his screaming face. You can't change your mind, said Steve. I want to get back in, screamed Carl, hanging from the wing of a plane 5,000 feet above the ground. I can't let you back in, said Steve. It's too dangerous. Ah, said Carol. Sorry, Carol, I can't let you back in, said Steve firmly, as though talking to a toddler whom he was forcing to jump from a plane. Ah, said Carol. Here's something important I learned from my time with Carol. There is only so much time you can spend hanging for dear life to the wing of a plane before you lose strength and then have to let go. In Carl's case, it was 2 minutes. Then he lost his grip and plunged to what to him must have seemed like imminent death, but was really just a sensation of imminent death that humans flirt with because we have no natural predators and have evolved into something ridiculous. Anyway, that exchange between Steve in the plane and Carl hanging from the wing of the plane is still the most interesting conversation I have ever witnessed. I've not seen or heard anything like it to this day, and I've done acid. Then, as Carl fell to his possible death, Steve turned to me, calm as you like, and said, "Your turn." That's it. So you can ask me anything at all if you have any more questions.
Anka has a question.
Yes, it's not about the last bit, but about more in general, because you mentioned when you started making music, it was very political. And I was wondering, would you consider your essays to be political as well? I mean, they are all about personal experiences, but then you could say things like mental health and care work, these are political issues. And would you say your writing is in a sense political?
Yeah, so I think it's political with a small p. I think the care work essay is quite political. I think I do make some points about what care workers are paid compared to what other people are paid, and what our society thinks is worthy and gives money to. I think in my journalism I'm quite political, but not. I don't write opinion columns. So I tend to focus on I write a column on television where I'm just trying to make people laugh. And then I do a lot of reporting on general stuff, but I tend to focus a lot on social justice issues. So I'm very interested in marginalized communities in Ireland. So whether it's inner city communities in Dublin or kids in the care system, I've written about undocumented care workers and people in asylum seekers and refugees. So in my work, I am political insofar as I like to throw a spotlight on those groups. I think it's kind of harder to be political in a book of essays like this, but then there is the things you choose to write about do say something about your politics. I think I am more, as a person, I am a lot more left-wing than I was. I think I started out as a posing anarchist punk, where I thought I was political, but really I was just posing. And as I have met more people and done more work as a reporter, I think I've just increasingly, my views just skewed to the left. I think society is rigged in favor of certain people, and I'm one of those people. I'm a middle class white straight man, and I'm very conscious that even anything bad I've experienced has been tempered by the fact I have privilege, and I think that needs to be, I just think that needs to be focused on more by society. I think people are really tempted to think Western democracies are meritocracies, and I don't think they generally are. There's different levels, some countries are better than others, it's interesting. Actually, what I was saying, I'm just thinking on my feet now. I think things like Emily Pine and Sinead Gleason's book are definitely political, and it's a bit less the case with my book, but that's purely because it's personal and it's who's writing it. It's to do with the essay boom in Ireland, if the essay boom is the right word, is partly built on female essayists kind of speaking to their experiences in a way that wouldn't have been possible in previous generations. So there is politics in that world. I just think it's harder to apply it to my book because as a relatively privileged white guy, it's not like my voice was underrepresented, you know.
Okay, great. I don't actually see any other hands or anybody else or anything in the chat. So I think we can leave it with that. And thank you very, very much for, thanks a million, as you say in Irish, for this wonderful talk, for those great passages that we could listen to, and also for this, I would say, very comprehensive answering of the questions that were put into the chat or asked. So thank you. And yes, I see lots of clapping hands. Is there anything else you would like to add at the end of your session?
No, not at all. Thanks a million for having me and for asking those great questions. If anyone has other questions and they want to contact me, you can fire ahead. My email is patrick.freyne, F-R-E-Y-N-E, @gmail.com. I'm always happy to answer questions about the book or things related to the book. So
that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, right. Maybe you stay in the Zoom if you want to, Patrick, for just a small chat after the lecture. And okay. Also the Irish Studies people, stay here, please, for a couple of minutes. And I wish everybody else a nice day and see you soon in this context or any other context. Bye-bye.